Morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, Prof.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me pleasure to introduce to you today our keynote speaker, Professor Elelwani Ramugondo, Deputy Dean, Postgraduate Education at the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Cape Town. She obtained both her undergraduate and postgraduate qualifications from the University of Cape Town. As a newly qualified occupational therapist, she established the first occupational therapy department at Chilidzini Special School, Limpopo Province, South Africa. She returned to the University of Cape Town as an academic in 1998, having served as an occupational therapist in rural South Africa and the United States of America. Professor Ramugondo's work at UCT over the past 21 years has focused on leading with integrity, recognizing this to be pivotal in advancing transformation and excellence as interdependent and interlinked concepts. As head of division for occupational therapy, she led a division which became the most diverse occupational therapy program, both nationally and internationally, in terms of its staff and students. During this time, she also spearheaded curriculum transformation of the occupational therapy undergraduate program. This process aimed for a graduate profile that is responsive to the local context while globally competitive. Professor Ramugondo has convened courses at both undergraduate and postgraduate levels and introduced critical decolonial pedagogical practices in teaching and research. Her approach to teaching and convening postgraduate courses has received international recognition, leading to numerous invitations to lead symposia for postgraduate students and faculty in the United Kingdom and South America. Here at home, she is often invited to give keynote addresses on transforming higher education or decolonizing the academy. She has supervised to completion 17 honors equivalent research projects, 12 master's dissertations, and 6 PhD theses. She was appointed Special Advisor on Transformation to the Vice Chancellor in 2015, and later became a member of the Strategic Executive Task Team during one of the most tumultuous times in the university's history. In these roles, she participated in complex, highly charged, faculty-based, and institution-wide initiatives. Her ability to engage with very diverse constituencies around issues that are strongly contested within the university led to Professor Ramugondo's nomination to be part of the university-wide curriculum change working group in 2016, and later to serve as co-chair. As co-chair of the curriculum change working group, she was instrumental in crafting the UCT curriculum change framework, which was released to the public in June 2018. Professor Ramugondo is the current chair of the Academic Freedom Committee, which has hosted 4 successful TB Davy lectures and managed to bring back esteemed public intellectual Professor Mahmoud Mamdani to give a lecture at UCT. Today, the title of her presentation is Whose Lives Matter in the Academy. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Professor Elelwani Ramugondo. Thank you.
Thank you for those very kind words, Professor Matoti. And colleagues, I greet you this morning and very privileged to be speaking to you. I am going to immediately share my screen so that we can start. I am sure you can see it now. Okay. Colleagues, my deepest gratitude go to Associate Professor Kasturi Behari Leek and the entire leadership of HELTASA for deeming me worthy to be one of your keynote speakers for this conference in 2020. I also wish to thank Dr. Ntswaki Malebu and her organizing committee for the conference. They've helped really not only to get us registered, but for me to find the right room to be able to address you this morning. Thank you. Colleagues, Professor Marwada was brilliant, short and sweet yesterday, and finished his keynote in half the time provided. I am going to need all my 50 minutes, noting that we've already borrowed 10 minutes into the talk so far. But I'm sure we will manage and that the program director will be kind. I will start, colleagues, with giving a synopsis of my talk today, and indicate that I will start with an introduction where I'll be checking in and situating the topic. And then we'll move on to attending to the why question, which is critical in my paper. And the why question will really center on the main purpose for the academy. And that will necessitate that we historicize the university, or the idea of the university. We will then move to attending to the high question, which will really be about disrupting colonial lies. Then we'll move on to the what question, which will entail naming the elephant in the room. And that, colleagues, is systemic racism. But we'll also offer some examples on how we can begin to dismantle systemic racism within the academy. And of course, then I will wrap up. Now, in checking in and situating the topic, I would like to invite you to pause and check your level of discomfort on encountering the topic of my paper for the first time. I'd also like for you to check whether this discomfort persists or not this morning. And colleagues, I'll really encourage all of us to be honest about our level of discomfort, because discomfort is crucial if we are to fulfill the ambitious challenge of creating enabling learning spaces for all. The conference theme is ambitious. What needs to be said is that behind the theme lies an assumption or even an admission that learning spaces have not been enabling spaces for all. Acknowledging this for HELTASA, an association concerned with higher education in Southern Africa, must be commended. If indeed we are admitting that learning spaces in the academy have not been enabling for all, one can then conclude that the discomfort that arises out of the question I pose in the title of my keynote, whose lives matter in the academy, probably stems from the fact that many of us already know the answer. And Dr. Ntswaki Malebu was very clear in her introductory remarks about how we had to contend with that question during COVID-19. We may already know the answer to the question, whose lives matter in the academy. that some people matter than others. The question then that may arise is that if we already know the answer, why continue with this paper? Colleagues, I wish to continue because in preparing the paper, I found that I had to confront our collective cultivated amnesia about who really matters in the academy and the steep challenge that lies ahead of us in creating enabling learning spaces for all. And by all, I hope we are not confined to those strictly within the walls of the academy, but also many publics that intersect with the academic project. Many communities, both local and global, particularly those that we often conduct research on or theorize about. I hope, therefore, that this keynote serves as a reminder, and I won't lie and suggest that it is a gentle reminder. Of course, it will be uncomfortable to be reminded again that cultivated amnesia thrives when we continue to repeat the lies that we often like to tell ourselves. But we need the lies that we continue to tell ourselves and each other within the academy to be exposed and discarded if we are to succeed in creating enabling learning spaces for all. But before I deal with some of the important lies that we often tell the world about ourselves as society, let me first share my reflections about the academy. It may come as a surprise to some, but I hope not. But I strongly believe in the role of the academy in advancing knowledge and the university as a space where we can cultivate hope about society's intertwined futures, both at local and global levels. Unfortunately, the academy or the university has not always served this role in society. To understand the role of the academy, even today, particularly on the African continent, it is important to first understand Africa's historical positioning in relation to the rest of the world. And here I would like to point to Walter Rodney and his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, in which he argues that Africa was deliberately exploited and underdeveloped by European colonial regimes. One of his main arguments throughout the book is that Africa developed Europe at the same rate as Europe underdeveloped Africa. Now, continuing on this vein is Howard Nicholas, a professor at the International Institute. I'm going to play a clip and will encourage you to raise the volume on your device if the audio is not strong enough your end.
Fundamentally designed to say is this: Africa historically, sub-Saharan Africa, has been fundamental to the global prosperity of the advanced countries. Okay, and Africa had a role to play. It has a role as a raw material producer. We will not allow sub-Saharan Africa to escape that. Okay, we do everything to keep sub-Saharan Africa where it is, also impoverished. It's absolutely vital for the prosperity of everyone else. So let's get clear about that. Okay, and this means all the economic structures, all the global institutions, and the economics we teach everyone is all designed to keep Africa exactly where it is. And whether it is Europe or US or now China, it's always the same. We need Africa to be impoverished because we need those raw materials and we need them dirt cheap. Okay, so that's the message. It doesn't mean to say that there's nothing Africans can do. Of course there is. Okay, but this is the opposition that they're fighting. This is what it's about. Because if Africa does do something different, I assure you living standards of all those in Europe and North America and Asia is going to fall. Okay, and that is a big price to pay. I assure you that the West is not going to allow that without a big fight. Okay, so this is what it's fundamentally about. What I want to show you is how these structures are operating It's just 20 minutes, so we can't do very much, but just to give you a little bit of an idea. And why I keep the ideology part there is because we are part of the producers of ideology. At universities and academic institutions, we are complicit in this whole enterprise. Okay, so the job of many Western academics is to convince Africans they have to keep doing what they're doing. Okay, and to show them it's your fault that you're poor. It's not our fault. It's your fault that you're poor. You know, so this is what we do in academic institutions, and I want to show it.
Now, listening to Howard Nicholas, one could say that it is almost a miracle that some of us continue to see the academy as a place for profound meaning-making for both academics and students. But for the academy to be such a profound space for meaning-making and learning, it needs to be a space for both contestation of ideas and deep resonance, especially for students whose lives will always reflect society in that their struggles, challenges, and hopes are deeply intertwined with the struggles and hopes of the communities from which they come. When all that the academy does is seek to impose knowledge that is disconnected from lived realities understood in context, cognitive dissonance and cultivated exclusion of marginalized bodies from the academy will continue. Such exclusion in a deeply unequal world will not always be tolerated by the masses. It will simply be difficult to sustain an academic project that only allows the exclusion of those the broader masses have pinned their hopes for a brighter future on, while those that continue to thrive represent minority groups within society, including the Black elite. History tells us that such an arrangement cannot be sustained for too long. Now I will turn to the lies that we often tell ourselves. There are many lies, but today I will focus on two. The first lie revolves around the falsehood of linear time. Tsepo Madlingozi, in critiquing the notion of linear time, invokes Frank Wilderson from Incognito, a memoir of exile and apartheid, and Sizwe from an interview with Shalim Swartz in Another Country, Everyday Social Restitution. And he writes, if time is an ocean rather than linear, as white cultural imperialism defines it, then 500 years is simultaneously this minute. The past is the past only for the sake of whites' comfort and safety. The past is not really past. Yes, it is the past in terms of the Constitution. That's the political rhetoric that we hear, close quote. Madlingozi departs from these powerful quotations in his scholarly piece entitled Social Justice in a Time of New Apartheid Constitutionalism, critiquing the anti-Black economy of recognition, incorporation, and distribution, in which he defends his thesis that judging from the lived experiences of South Africa's socially excluded and racially discriminated, specifically Abahlali baseMjondolo, or Abahlali for short, an almost 20-year-old, approximately 10,000 strong social movement of shack dwellers. This current time is that of new apartheid constitutionalism. From Abahlali's vantage point, it becomes clear that the majority of Black people are not simultaneous with the dominant society made up of white people and the Black elites. Madlingozi thus argues to be denied simultaneity is not to belong to the new society. The phrase, the time of new apartheid, suggests that both colonialism and apartheid have survived the so-called transition from apartheid to post-apartheid, in that impoverished Black people remain where they have been for years, even if the popular narrative is that we are in a new society, the new South Africa, or even a new dawn. In this sense, that Abahlali mourn that those trapped on the other side of the false narrative are the forgotten, which Madlingozi understands as being left behind from the proverbial bridge to the new South Africa. Bringing these reflections to bear within the academy, there can be no stronger symbolic act to mark this proverbial bridge and what it means for the idea of a university in South Africa than Tumani Matwele throwing poo at the Cecil John Rhodes statue at the University of Cape Town on the 9th of March, 2015. The Rose Must Fall protest that precipitated that poo-throwing act by Matwele and the subsequent rallying call for the decolonization of the academy reverberated both nationally and globally. What we should never forget is that what those protests did very pointedly was to disrupt the narrative that rode on the 1994 Mandela moment, which Dimitri Erasmus and Harry Garuba call the narrative of forgiveness and reconciliation, which many, unfortunately, believe to be the only path to a new, inclusive, and democratic future. The second lie I present in this paper, linked to the first lie about the linearity of time, is the notion of a new society, or to be precise, the existence of a non-racial society in South Africa, or in many parts of the world for that matter. Here I bring in Sandu Hira, a Surinamese decolonial scholar schooled in economics, who currently resides in The Hague in the Netherlands. In dispelling the lie that there is very little known about how to decolonize the academy, Hira illustrates that key to decolonizing universities is clearly articulating the difference between Eurocentric epistemology and decolonial epistemology. In doing just that, Hira argues that central to Eurocentric epistemology is the production of ideas and concepts that enable us to understand reality, both natural and social reality, in a manner that requires that one should never judge what those concepts mean when confronted with lived experiences. By extension, this means that we can understand reality without ever needing to judge it. The main argument here is that knowledge is about seeking the truth. If you understand it, you can simply then just act on it. If your understanding is deemed correct and objective, it does not matter who you are. So in essence, it does not matter who investigates reality. But by separating the knower and their judgment from understanding reality, Eurocentric epistemology allows for the production of lies as objective knowledge. To drive this point home, Hira uses the concept of discovery as an example. The notion of discovery is strongly embedded within the narrative of science and civilization as the triumph of humanity. Yet we know very well that everywhere where explorers went all over the world from Europe, what is called discovery has a counter narrative from indigenous people and is called occupation. Yet the lie of discovery continues within westernized civilization and knowledge production, even as the 600 statues of Christopher Columbus all over the world begin to fall one after another. As long as Eurocentric epistemology is allowed to have concepts such as discovery hide the narrative of pillage, subjugation, and genocide behind science, the academy will never be decolonized, and there is no hope for creating enabling learning spaces for all. In contrast to all this, decolonial epistemology not only attempts to understand reality by seeking truth, but also by identifying lies, as we've seen with Madlingozi's critique of linear time in the context of South Africa, and as we will soon see with the so-called non-racial society. Whilst the ideal of a non-racial society is what we should all strive towards, it does not help the cause when we pretend that we are already there. Tested against reality, the notion of a non-racial society falls apart. The year 2020 will go down in history as one in which systemic racism and COVID-19 converged. During these times, one of the most fascinating observations has been about the politics of life itself. This, unsurprisingly, like most intense debates, thanks to social media, played out on Twitter. The fierce debate around whose lives matter, specifically the juxtaposition between hashtag Black Lives Matter and hashtag All Lives Matter, tells us much about the intractable contestation about what it means to be human in a grossly unequal world. Professor Thuli Madonsela versus Reverend Kenneth Mwisho's Twitter exchange stands out especially, with Madonsela having to draw parallels between Black Lives Matter and the plight of the rhino, responding, "Dear at Rev Meshwe, when I say hashtag save the rhino, I don't mean to don't save other animals. I'm stepping up for the rhino by putting a spotlight on his plight. If you respond to my hashtag save the rhino call with hashtags save all wildlife, you are unconsciously displacing that spotlight. Hashtag empathy, hashtag BLM, close quote." It has proven very difficult to argue against that tweet, unless one believes that rhinos deserve to die. A welcome and productive intervention that came with the revival of the decolonial discourse within the academy in recent times has been a compelling and clearer definition of racism. This understanding of racism was articulated by the Puerto Rican University of California, Berkeley-based sociologist Ramon Grossfugel, informed by the collective work of authors such as Wallenstein, Fanon, and De Souza Santos, in which he says, racism is a global hierarchy of superiority and inferiority along the line of the human that has been politically, culturally, and economically produced and reproduced for centuries by the institutions of the capitalist, patriarchal, Western-centric, Christian-centric, and modern colonial world system. Considering that in the public discourse, racism tends to be reduced to being about everyday expressions of interpersonal bias and prejudice, a number of us find Grossfugel's definition helpful for three specific reasons. It politicizes racism by foregrounding unequal power relations involving a dehumanization dynamic. 2, it historicizes racism by presenting its longue durée origins and evolution. And 3, it emphasizes racism as systemic. One of the not so smallanyana skeleton of systemic racism hides in the idea or notion of the academy or the university by virtue of its ethical philosophical foundation of humanism. This may sound rather incredulous, but many scholars, along with Madlingozi, have shown that the dominant creed of human rights arose in the context of European expansion or colonization, when the fathers of global Western international law had to sketch out the rights that European settler invaders, the humans, possessed in Indian lands. Of course, there are great strides in today's iterations of human rights as a language of aspiration, which we must continue to protect for everyone. But history teaches us, sadly, that both humanism and systemic racism arise simultaneously out of colonial conquest. It is for this reason that David Pollock, trustee of Humanists UK and sometime president of the European Humanist Federation, honestly observes from where he is located in our globalized community during the 21st century and asks, what sort of right do third world citizens have to goods that simply cannot be provided? Close quote. It becomes important then to delve into history to understand why there is such a thing as a third world country, and why is it that goods cannot be provided for citizens of such countries. Earlier in this paper, Howard Nicholas shows us how this continues to be the case. But let's unpack the history fully. Humanism emerged during the 17th century, declared the Age of Reason, and grew during the 18th century, dubbed the Age of Enlightenment in Western Europe. Prior to this, in 1492, Christopher Columbus had mistakenly landed in what we now know as the Americas, initiating the conquest conquest of that continent. The white male Christian European settlers had unexpectedly encountered people who they ended up naming Indians because they erroneously thought they had landed in the Indies. This discovery posed a serious dilemma that took 60 years to be resolved during the 1552 Valadore Debate in Spain. It is important to point out that Columbus' exploration and colonization of the Americas was sponsored from Spain by the Catholic monarchs. It is also interesting that Valadore, a city in Spain, is also known as a university city, with the University of Valadore regarded one of the oldest universities in the world, having been established in 1241. The 1552 Valadore Debate involved Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, a Spanish Renaissance humanist, theologian, and proponent of colonial slavery, and Bartolomé de las Casas, a landowner, friar, priest, and bishop. In order to determine whether the Indians could be enslaved, the question that arose was whether they possessed a soul or not. Once the debate resolved that these Indians had a soul, it was also decided that their souls were endangered and needed to be saved by being Christianized. With time, it became clear that the civilization project became essentially convert or I kill you. To be Indian without being a Christian translated into being a lesser human, deserving to die. This is referred to as religious racism, the predecessor to the color racism that subsequently enabled a 3 centuries Europeans-run Atlantic captive trade between Africa and the Americas. As you can see, these 3 centuries, 16th, 17th, and 18th, ran parallel to the emergence and growth of humanism during the Age of Reason and the Age of Enlightenment. During the progressive era, towards the end of the 19th and into the early 20th century, the founding of many disciplines within the academy coincided with the emergence of the eugenics movement, which advanced scientific or biological racism, the pseudo-scientific belief that empirical evidence exists to support or justify racism and racial inferiority or superiority. In 1948, while the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was ratified by most, but not all, member nations, Article 1 of 30 spelling out that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, in South Africa, apartheid laws were enforced by a 10% white minority on a 90% Black majority population. In the United States, during the period 1954 to 1968, the civil rights movement unfolded, and in 2013, Black Lives Matter was founded. These historical snapshots reveal that the civilizing project kicked off by European modernity and humanism was based on the racist premise, the not so small skeleton after all. And perhaps even a third lie for our purposes today, that being human was and continues to be not be a given for all. This strong assertion is illustrated very strongly in a PhD thesis by my life partner, otherwise partner in crime, Frank Cronenberg, whose work emerges later as I begin to conclude the paper. Let's now unpack how racism manifests. Firstly, racism manifests systemically, which is depicted here metaphorically as a large spider web. It reflects what Grossfugel articulated as a global, as a capitalist, patriarchal, Western-centric, Christian-centric, modern colonial world system. Secondly, racism manifests structurally, here presented by the sections of the web that touch, for example, in the context of South Africa, apartheid spatial planning that continues today in various forms, colonial and apartheid legislation on land, starting with the Natives Land Act of 1913, which reserved nearly 90% of land in the country for a tiny minority, with little shifts to reverse this massive land grab. Until today, limited access to arable land and apartheid spatial planning leads to inadequate access to health, education, jobs, housing, and security for the vast Black majority in the country. Protests, which remain the only way for a disenfranchised majority to communicate with their own otherwise Black government, is met with police brutality, as we saw with the murder of Andrew Statane and the Marikana massacre. Key to the structural arrangements that keep anti-Black systemic racism intact are the global economic structures which survive the formal ending of colonization. Again, Howard Nicholas is important to listen to in the rest of the YouTube clip I showed you earlier to understand how dominant economic powers and global entities such as the IMF and the World Trade Organization collude to keep colonized countries in perpetual need for aid and forever in debt. Thirdly, racism manifests institutionally, here presented by the threads that run throughout. Examples of key institutions include law, education, healthcare, and the media. For our purposes today, I will stick to education or the academy to demonstrate how institutions often perpetuate systemic racism. Institutional racism speaks most directly to us as professions and disciplines within the academy, especially considering the demographic and geographical political makeup of professors, students, researchers, and executive team members who are often celebrated within the academy. First, again, Howard Nicholas shows that the economics that is taught in many of our universities perpetuates a lie. The doctrine of comparative advantage, which in simple terms means a country or company's ability to produce a particular good or service at a lower opportunity cost than its trading partners, giving it a comparative advantage to sell goods and services at a lower price than its competitors and realize stronger sales margins. The lie here is that by simply reducing the price of its raw materials, Africa, for instance, could one day be like China, North America, or Europe. But even a primary school learner knows that in a society primed for finished, cheap, shiny products, a country with zero ability to produce such goods will become increasingly poor, regardless of how much so-called pro-poor strategies or poverty alleviation initiatives you institute. Just like Kimberly Jones says, using the Monopoly game as an analogy, if the game is already rigged in favor of the dominant player, there's no winning for the opponent. So to economists in the room, why do many of you continue to teach a blatant lie? The second example for how racism manifests institutionally through education is closer to heart for me as someone from health sciences. I was very pleased when recently my colleague from UCT's Faculty of Health Sciences, Professor Njobe Kontusi, wrote an editorial piece for the South African Heart Journal, for which he's the editor, in which he acknowledged a long history of racism in medicine, science, and in medical publishing, making important pledges, including being vigilant of research that may perpetuate racism. Many of you will be familiar with how medicine has an ugly record of scientific racial abuses, including the Tuskegee study, where Black men with syphilis were not informed of their status and did not receive treatment. And the Sims vaginal speculum, which was developed through horrific surgeries performed on enslaved Black women without anesthesia. When you look up the Sims vaginal speculum on Wikipedia, the record is silent on the atrocities unleashed on Black women in order to advance gynecology as a discipline. But there's little comfort in the thought that these atrocities may be a thing of the past, because such a thought is misguided. The conduct may have become less overt and callous, but with similarly devastating effects. For instance, we still need to fully understand why Black people worldwide are dying disproportionately in higher numbers relative to other racialized groups to COVID-19. Going back to Gross-Frugal's explanation of racism as a global hierarchy of superiority and inferiority along the line of the human, one can begin to link systemic racism with premature death. The understanding of racism along the line of the human is informed by the work of Frantz Fanon, the late French West Indian psychiatrist and political philosopher from the French colony of Martinique. The space above the racialized line of being human depicts the zone of being, and the space below the zone of non-being. In the zone of being, which is linked to whiteness, and from where othering is done, as we saw with the 1552 Valadore Debate in Spain about whether the Indians had a soul or not, humanity of the people in this zone is recognized and regarded as a given. In the zone of non-being, linked to Blackness, and where one is subjected to othering, humanity is not recognized. It is always under question. The dominant way of handling social conflicts in the zone of being manifests materially through regulation and emancipation, and other oppressions such as classism, sexism, and ableism are mitigated by racial privilege. Whereas in the zone of non-being, conflicts are dominantly responded to through violence and dispossession, and other oppressions are aggravated by racial oppression. Above the line of the human, there is also hyperhumanization, even in the context of mediocrity, while below the line of the human, premature death is often certain. I will come back to hyperhumanization above the line of the human in a moment, but a powerful illustration of premature death in the zone of non-being comes from accounts from Abahlali, captured in Unfreedom Day 2014. We mourn 20 years of unfreedom. 20 years after apartheid, we live like pigs in the mud. Our children die of diarrhea. We are forced into transit camps at gunpoint. The police beat and shoot us in the streets, and the assassins kill us with impunity. If we stand up and demand that our humanity is recognized, we are removed from the housing list and placed on the death list. Close quote. From this, Madlikosi reflects that even under conditions of constitutional democracy, a culture of human rights, most pertinently the hegemonic discourse of social justice, if you are poor and Black, you can be killed with impunity. My own observations is that even if one is not poor, but nonetheless Black, premature death becomes you. You matter as long as you do not challenge the status quo. Between the poor Black and the elite Black who challenges the status quo, it is the manner of death that becomes of significant or material difference. It is perhaps not police brutality for the Black elite, but something else which accompanies the mirage of upward mobility. With COVID-19 mortalities, we have seen a pattern affecting the urban Black. We've seen some with comorbidities dying amidst relative opulence, surrounded by top specialists. That you matter as a Black person has a limit. It is borrowed time. Again, you matter as long as you do not challenge the status quo. Coming back to hyperhumanity in the zone of being, I could not find a stronger example than one in the academy where a white person can be elevated to professor when they were not even an associate professor during a senior appointment process with no consequences. Whilst a brilliant Black scholar, clinician, scientist, and mentor can be driven to suicide, again, with no real consequences for those who could have prevented the tragedy. This dialogic between hyperhumanity and premature death succeeds through co-option into the zone of being for those historically marginalized, which Madlingozi calls incorporation. Extending human rights to the historically dehumanized, of reconstituting political society and of reconfiguring civil society functions to seduce historical victims of social exclusion and anti-Black racism into theological whiteness. The idea that being white and the attainment of whiteness are the highest ideals of emancipation and human progress. A term I conceptualized for my own doctoral work, occupational consciousness, speaks to this idea of seduction by the dynamics of hegemony or coloniality, alerting historically oppressed people to become conscious about what they do every day so as not to be easily co-opted and find that their everyday sweat and toil only serve to perpetuate dominant interests. Within the academy, mimicry of whiteness is handsomely rewarded and follows a similar anti-Black economy of recognition in cooperation and distribution, which Madlingozi critiques so powerfully. There is therefore grave danger in displacing the spotlight on what needs to change in the academy, including curricula, towards creating enabling spaces for all. From UCT, the work of the Curriculum Change Working Group brought forth the Curriculum Change Framework. On the cover, we have Sitembile Msezana, an artist. Within the framework, the 4 questions we asked continuously as we engaged the whole university community on how to decolonize curricula were: what knowledge, whose knowledge, what or who gets privileged, and whose interests dominate. Interestingly, this work was followed by another document titled Taking Curriculum Change Forward. Interestingly, in that second document, there were clear attempts to drop the decolonization discourse as part of meaningful curriculum change. In the framework, we were also unapologetic about talking about the work needing to be Black-led, but that was not accepted. It was viewed as divisive, almost a swear word. But if we were only just feminists fighting for inclusion, would men be tasked with leading that inclusion? Well, if that is allowed, then we must expect that it would be inclusion only on men's terms. Black-led does not mean white exclusion. It merely means for a change, white people need to learn to follow. Is that a crime? It is the insistence of white leadership at all costs. And here I'm not talking about leadership as figureheads, but truly leading the academic project. Insistence of white leadership for the academic project, even when mediocre, is a stark reminder of who really matters in the academy. Now I'm going to share some of our future work focused on centering African languages. Let me show you why this is important through this next clip.
Hi everyone, my name is Siwe Toto. I'm an occupational therapist. I'm from South Africa. I'm a Xhosa speaker, but I also do speak English. So I'm telling you that because as an occupational therapist, I struggle between this knowing that I have, which is in English, and this deeper knowing, which is in my mother tongue. And so when I sometimes have to try to translate concepts from one language to the other, there's quite a lot of things that go missing, and I often have to be very slow in the translation so that I can get everything out. So I'll give you a few examples, which are in what we do a lot in occupational therapy and occupational science, studying what human beings do. So the first thing is that we as Xhosa people never decided on the word Africa. So Africa is this word that we have been given or has been imposed on us to define the continent. But the closest word or approximation that we have in Xhosa is Kwantu. And Kwantu means where humans come from. And it is not only a geographical understanding, there's a temporal understanding. Immediately when you say Kwantu, we think back, but we also think about what's happening now. And we also think about the people, because Mtu means human in my language. So that's why it's where human beings come from. And then being human in isiXhosa is called Ubuntu, to be human. And Ubu means to embody that which is human, so Ubuntu. But to know what is human, we can't understand it with just one person, or we have to, so Ubuntu, that's why it's relational. So Umuntu, Umuntu, Kabantu means that I know that I am you, when I look at you that we are no different. And because we are no different, we are therefore human beings, because when we look at other people, they resemble us in every way. So that's what Ubuntu means for us. It's very relational. Then, obviously, being human is also about doing. So we have another concept called isintu. Isintu means what humans do and what humans ought to do and what humans have been doing. So we normally invoke this when modernity or, for the lack of a better word, civilization tells us to do things that don't fit our cultural logic and reasoning. And then when things are just falling apart, then normally the elders will say, let's do it the Isintu way, how humans have been doing things. So those are just a few reflections that I have around humans and in my language, IsiXhosa. Now I'm thinking perhaps we could have theorization from our mother tongues, from our mother languages about humans and human doing, and then leave it to whoever wants to translate that into English. But trying to translate English back into isiXhosa for us has not worked. There are words that just don't exist in my language. And it's not just the word doesn't exist, the concept is just ridiculous. For example, I was just saying now, human beings are two words or two, right? In isiXhosa, we don't have that. A human is a human is a human. We don't have a being. So when you say human beings are occupational beings, we only say humans are humans because they do. So umuntu ngoba uyenza. Okanye umuntu owenzayo. A human is a human that does things. Is that?
In that vein, Professor Pikita Ntuli talks about how the term funeral robs African languages of the idea of burying people in ways that attest to how they may have lived their lives or have been experienced by others in their communities. And this is in isiZulu. But is your fihla going to hide for someone who brought embarrassment to the family and communities or society as a whole? Siyolahla, we are going to throw away this person, a person who may have been a murderer or rapist. Siyanyusa, siyokweza, we are going to elevate for someone who set a good example in society. Siyotshala, we are going to plant so that they can spread for someone who made an important contribution in society. As I begin to wrap up, I need to emphasize that from a Eurocentric perspective, being human is a given for some and not others, based simply on racialized identities, and increasingly and within a neoliberal capitalist society, something that can be purchased. Whereas from traditions, as we can see here with the Nguni language, being human is never a given. It is always work in progress. And full humanity must be earned through actions that humanize the self and others. From Frank Cronenberg's PhD, it is confirmed that indeed being human is not a given, but a political potentiality on a continuum between oppression and liberation. Oppression is where humanity is negated, and liberation is where humanity is affirmed, which comes with healing. Frank's work draws heavily from Ubuntu as a radical African philosophical ethic of critical humanism. Being human, like the white man or woman, is not progress at all, but an entrenchment of anti-Black systemic racism and a colossal move towards the destruction of life itself. A key proposition in this keynote is an appeal for a knowledge project that affirms humanity and demonstrates integrity where knowledge is truthful, credible, and ethically generated. Madlingozi dismantles the notion that the past is behind us. Howard Nicholas reminds us of our complicity within the academy, and Sendu Hira alerts us to the lies embedded in Eurocentric knowledge. If you are still unconvinced, I urge you to look up this Mail and Guardian article titled, "Economists Should Really Look Wider Before Speaking About Schools" by the C19 People's Coalition. They were responding to a group of economists who had argued that closing schools during lockdown was a huge mistake and that teachers who oppose opening schools are selfishly undermining our society's response to the pandemic and will increase inequality. In their critique, the C19 People's Coalition charged that the economists' argument did not square well with the views and experiences of teachers, caregivers, and children from the majority Black population the economists were seemingly writing about. In concluding that article, they write, "Teachers, learners, and caregivers are drawing our attention to the unacceptable and deeply unequal conditions they have endured amidst a brutal austerity program enacted by the government for years. Instead of positioning them as the enemy, it is time to recognize that they are human beings who have valuable knowledge." Close quote. Colleagues, we can't be human all by ourselves. And perhaps it is time to synthesize the thesis, Black Lives Matter, and its antithesis, All Lives Matter, into until Black Lives Matter, there's no all that matters. Otherwise, the all, even in our 2020 theme, creating enabling learning spaces for all, will remain a big, fat, white lie. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much, Prof, for the inspiring speech. That is thought-provoking. I think most of us, your speech caused us to think deeply about what has been said. I picked up your words that said that knowledge is about seeking the truth, and we can't seek the truth without knowing our past, our history, and how does that history impact us. Thank you very much. I think for now, we will take some questions. I noticed that there are a lot of comments about what has been said. There's a question here that I can pick up here that says, can we still focus on so narrowly on technological tools when not all lives matter? There's one question like that one. The first question that I also picked up was, how do we mobilize for change in higher education? Those are the two questions that I picked up in our chat room. So I will give Prof to respond to those two questions. The first one is that one of how do you mobilize for change in higher education? And the other one is the one that I just read now. Can we still focus on so narrowly on technological tools when not all lives matter?
Mm.
Yes,
Yeah.
those are questions that I...
Thank you. Those are very, very important questions. And I'm going to start with the one about how we can mobilize within the academy. And what has become increasingly clear for me since 2015, because I think since 2015, many of us were pushed into waking up to the danger of assimilation, where, yes, you are highly regarded within a university, but you increasingly become disconnected from your community where you came from, and you actually become useless for them. When they see you, perhaps you're bringing goods, shiny objects, but there's very little of value that you leave behind. What I have seen from quarters where people heeded the clarion call within disciplines, I've seen people who are beginning to speak from within the disciplines. So when you engage students who are upset, angry, and are calling out what is not working within the academy, the worst thing we can do is to bury those students, bury those voices. This is our future. When we bury them, we bury not only them, but our own descendants. So when I've seen people speak from within disciplines, I've seen how powerful it is, because it begins to engage those questions, those points of blind spots that are being opened for us, and saying, yes, there is something we need to disclose from within the disciplines that has been wrong. So what Sanju Hira is showing here by an economist, and saying, but you can't call discovery today still discovery, when we know, Victoria Falls discovered, really, when there were people there who can tell you the name of those places with Watunya. How can it be that as academics, we continue to perpetuate lies in the existence of evidence that the opposite is true? What Madlingozi does within law to really say, can we really talk about a constitution that works for all, when he has witnessed that it doesn't work for the most, with Abahlali. They have victories now and again, but it's gone, it's taken away soon when there's an appeal. So exactly who is this constitution for? So when you have a legal mind who begins to engage with constitutional law and begins to tease out what is faulty, we can only make the world that we live in better. On the second question around technology, Prof. Marara is an amazing brain and an amazing scholar. And what I liked about what he was saying yesterday was that industrialization around AI should be where we focus, right? So where we don't continue to be just consumers. What he's saying, or what he said yesterday, links with what Howard Nicholas is opening our eyes to. That, if indeed the idea is to keep Africa behind everybody else, then it means that technology, in terms of production, will never happen on this continent. We will just be consumers who are increasingly made poorer, such that we cannot afford these technologies anyway for much longer. But it's a system that doesn't see the human. It sees products, it sees sales, it sees profit. So, technology on its own is not bad. It's what we use it for. And for Africa to not only be consuming, but also producing, and producing ethically.
Thank you very much, Prof. Because of time, I'll take the last question here that says that, what are your thoughts on the word decolonization has been appropriated in the academy, and how do we reclaim the word as a position of disruption and abolishment? That will be the last question for today.
Great question. And this critique comes from indigenous populations all over the world. And this is the amazing work that I'm beginning to see from some of us within the academy, where we connect with indigenous populations wherever we find ourselves. If we're in New Zealand with the Maori, if we're in Australia with the Aboriginals, if we're in Canada with indigenous populations in Canada, and then the African diaspora everywhere. And indigenous populations have been very clear. I mean, including the Khoi and the San communities from the Western Cape, where we have access to them. For them, decolonization is not about making life easier for us academics. That would be a complete dishonoring of the struggle that people have waged since the beginning of slavery. Decolonization is about bringing back what was stolen. It is about beginning to heal from trauma. It is about making a continent such as Africa and places such as Oyotora, New Zealand, places of healing. Indigenous populations in North America, in South America, carry valuable indigenous knowledge about how humans heal. When we don't engage with those communities, we rob ourselves, and we are on a fast bullet train to destruction. So decolonization and co-option by the academy, one, it will not work because it will be academics talking to themselves about something that means zilch for communities. And communities are not going to stop doing the work. And they have partners within the academy. The struggle has just been cranked up in terms of impact. And we're ready for it.
Thank you very much, Prof, for all your responses. And according to all the comments, there are people who said they wish that they have your recording so that they can listen it again, so that they can think more about, like I said, it is thought-provoking, and it caused us to think back and sit and see how the education system is being influenced by our past and how to deal with it. Thank you very much, Prof, for your speech today. Thank you very much.